Hey guys, how's it going? A couple weeks ago I made a video showing some of the stuff I used to collect when I had more disposable income and I was buying stuff off of eBay and kind of buying more high-ticket items at a record stores, things like that. And a couple of things I showed were some records off the OnU Sound label, which is a label out of England, started in the early 80s that kind of specializes in reggae, dub reggae, and then later incorporating kind of like post-punk and industrial, even some hip-hop influences into the mix. Really interesting label and a really cool guy behind the label. Does some really cool productions and mixing and remixing, things like that. And so I thought I'd kind of go through. I've got a pretty big collection. My collection is mostly on CD. I collected most of this stuff. At the time I was more into CDs and vinyl, and it was a lot easier to get on CD at the time. So, I'll try to give just a quick history of who the guy was who started the label, and then I'll get into the different kind of acts, projects, and musicians from the label, and show some of the releases. So the guy who started the label, his name was Adrian Sherwood, and grew up in England. And by the time he was a young teenager, 13, 14, was big into reggae. That was his thing, and collecting records, hitting up the record shops, and he'd met a Jamaican guy who owned a club, like a dance club, and actually was allowed to come and DJ at the club in the afternoons. You know, he's like 14 years old. And so between the club and this older Jamaican guy who was kind of like his father figure, his mentor, and just, I guess, shopping, hitting up the record shops and talking to the people, he starts to make some connections. And by the time he's 17 years old, he gets a job with a company that distributes Jamaican reggae records in the UK. And the company starts its own record label called Carib Gems. And Sherwood becomes a junior director, is the title, by the time he's 17 years old. And which means he gets to select some of the artists they record and some of the material and things like that. Although he's not really, I don't think, mixing the stuff at this point, or engineering or anything. And that lasts a couple years, and by the time he's 19, the company folds, and he's actually in debt. I guess he put some of his own money into that label, and money he borrowed against his mom's house. So he starts up, he's 19 years old now, and it's 1977. He starts up his own record label with a friend of his, named Pete Stroud, who as a musician goes by the name Dr. Pablo. He'll show up later in these records and stuff. But they started a label called Hit Run, and some of the records they put out on the label feature a guy who, or one of the records, a guy he became friends with, a Jamaican, not really singer in the traditional sense, but a guy named Prince Far. And this record, especially, it's called Cry Tough Dub Encounter Chapter 1. And Prince Far with backing band The Arabs.
Not to get a phone call, cannot answer the royal telephone, cannot the dreadlocks going home. Me lick down Rome and me leave and come home, not to going home, cannot the don't use comb, cannot the fling one stone, man and it lick down Rome, cannot the not the leave and come home, cannot not the don't name the Rome.
And then the backing band, The Arabs, kind of becomes his band Creation Rebel. It's basically the same musicians in the beginning, and he puts out, I think, 2 or 3 Creation Rebel records on the Hit Run label. And at this point, he's getting involved in the engineering and the mixing of these records. And so the Hit Run label, they also put out some stuff by different musicians. I think Prince Hammer was one of them, and some of the stuff he wasn't involved in himself. It was just more of a business, putting out some stuff he's involved in, putting out stuff other people involved in. And it only lasted a couple of years, and then he starts another label real briefly called 4D Rhythms, and they put out just one record. But it's a really good one. Another one by Creation Rebel called Starship Africa. And what it was, there were some rhythms and stuff he'd recorded back in about 78, and just didn't think they were quite up to snuff. And in 1980, kind of came back and revisited them, and brought in some different musicians to do some overdubs, drums and percussion and stuff. And one of them was a drummer named Style Scott, a Jamaican musician, had his own band, Roots Radix. And so they overdubbed a lot of percussion stuff on it, and one of the interesting things he did, he flipped the tape as he was recording. So then when you played it back with all the other tracks, the percussion and drums and everything, cymbal crashes, they're all in reverse. But that label was short-lived. They only put out the one release, Starship Africa, which was later reissued on his next label, which he started in 1980-81, which was OnU Sound Records. And let me see if I can show the... try to find a good copy of the logo here. Yeah, there you can see the OnU Sound logo. So yeah, I guess about 1980, 81, I think it was, he started this label, and the idea of it was pretty much to just put out his own productions, things he brought the musicians in and mixed and everything himself. And so, yeah, so the label, he continues putting out stuff from Creation Rebel, and they sort of morph into a project which later became like a real band called Dub Syndicate. Basically the same musicians from Creation Rebel, although some of the people kind of came and went, and some of the albums had vocals, some didn't, some were just pure dub, instrumental type stuff. The first Dub Syndicate album was called The Pounding System, and it was a real stripped down, vocal-less, instrumental type dub. Some of the other albums from Dub Syndicate with Dr. Pablo, Sherwood's friend who played the melodica, kind of took the name Dr. Pablo as a play on Augustus Pablo, the Jamaican musician who famous for playing the melodica, although this Dr. Pablo is a white guy. This one was really strong album. Tunes from the Missing Channel. This is from like 1985. And then Strike the Balance, another really good one. And some of the later Dub Syndicate stuff, it over time it kind of Styles Scott, the drummer, kind of takes over the band, and eventually it actually kind of becomes his band. Whereas the later releases in the late 90s up until the mid 2000s, a lot of them came out on his own label, Lion and Roots, and yeah, kind of mixed stuff. Some of the ones on the OnU Sound label, some of the other ones Live at the Town and Country, 1991, really good one. I'm not sure if that ever came out on vinyl. Echomania, Fear of a Green Planet, this one actually on a couple different labels, I think Lion and Roots, or Shanachi, I think in the US. Yeah, just some variety of different stuff. And unfortunately Styles Scott was, he just completed an album with Dub Syndicate called Hard Food in 2014 and was shot dead in Jamaica. So unfortunately that's the end of Dub Syndicate. But along the same lines, there was a project, I think there were 4 albums released under the name Singers and Players, which is basically kind of the foundation being Dub Syndicate, the musicians, and then of course I think they were all vocal tracks. You had a variety of different singers like Prince Farai, Bem Sherman, Mikey Dread, I can't remember some of the Congo, Ashanti Roy. People like that, different Jamaican musicians. Kind of a more traditional roots reggae feel to a lot of these.
Africa's blood, Chidana, Africa's blood, Chidana, Africa's blood, Chidana, Africa's blood, Chidana. As it was in the beginning, so shall it be in this time. Looting and shooting and killing, they committing all kind of crime. Africa's blood, Chidana, Africa's blood, Chidana.
And I think they've been reissuing some of the Singers and Players stuff on vinyl in the past few years. And like I mentioned, Bem Sherman, a great Jamaican singer, he'd actually come to England to tour with the band Creation Rebel back around 78, 79, along with Prince Farai. Creation Rebel was the backing band for them. They did a tour with like 4 different singers, with Creation Rebel backing them and Adrian Sherwood doing the live mixing. And at the end of the tour, Bem Sherman stayed, and he shows up on a lot of the OnU Sound recordings. This one, his first solo album for the label, Across the Red Sea.
Slummy ghetto, all over the place. Slummy ghetto, all over the place. Among many faces, among many faces. Don't matter where you are, whether you are near or far.
Again, kind of more traditional roots reggae. Yeah, the Creation Rebel back in the late 70s when they toured, they played in support of like the Clash. At one point they were touring with Don Cherry, the jazz musician, and the all-girl punk group, the Slits. So a real interesting tour that must have been. And let's see what else. Actually, the first actual LP released by the label, by OnU Sound, was a band, or not really a band, but more of a project called the New Age Steppers. And another one from New Age Steppers, Action Battlefield. Really interesting stuff, some of the more experimental stuff early on the label. Eventually, I think Bem Sherman took over most of the vocal duties on some of the later albums. Here's another one. It's the only one I've got on vinyl. I don't have a whole ton of OnU Sound stuff on vinyl, but it's pretty expensive because a lot of the stuff, you know, if you want to buy it, you have to get it out of Europe. So it's not too available here in the U.S. This is Foundation Steppers, original pressing. And then another of the early projects on the label is called African Head Charge. And what it was, around 1981, the Brian Eno and David Byrne album came out called My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, which incorporated a lot of samples and stuff. And Brian Eno, I guess, had made a comment, something like he had visions of a psychedelic Africa. And so that was publicized in the press, and Adrian Sherwood saw that quote and thought, it was kind of a load of crap. This is Brian Eno, the Roxy Music guy, but the more he thought about it, he thought the concept was intriguing. Music from a psychedelic Africa. And so he sat down with a percussionist named Banjo Ayabengi Noah, and laid down some sort of African percussion tracks, and then brought in some of the different musicians from like Dub Syndicate, and sat down to create sort of a psychedelic African reggae sort of thing. Some pretty experimental stuff. The title on this, My Life in a Hole in the Ground, is obviously a take on the My Life in the Bush of Ghosts. And this is a recent, they just have been reissuing all the African Head Charge stuff, or the first 4 releases I should say, on vinyl just recently, along with some unreleased tracks and mixes, things like that. So these are fairly easy to get at the moment, being just reissued. Pretty good stuff. Some of the other stuff, early stuff from African Head Charge, Off the Beaten Track, and Drastic Season. And some of the more odd of the early stuff to come out on the label, a band called London Underground, which was a group of, I guess, white British musicians playing sort of roots reggae meets post-punk, punk. Kind of hard to describe. This is our first release at home with the London Underground full-length LP, And then they put out a, I guess an EP called Current Affairs Session, which started to get a little more experimental and was a little more interesting.
Oh dear. Here it comes. As we sit, drawing lots. Alive, huddled happy, that makes a smile. It grows and grows. Needs a laugh. Troubled. As we sit.
And then, let's see, another of the early projects under the name Playgroup. This is a compilation of their 2 albums that came out. I think these both came out actually on Cherry Red, but they were called Epic Sound Battles Chapter 1 and Epic Sound Battles Chapter 2. And I read like the story behind the first release was rhythm tracks that were recorded for an album they planned for Don Cherry, the jazz musician, rhythm tracks to back him, and it never happened, so they took the rhythm tracks and remixed them and brought in different musicians and came out under the name Playgroup. Another project called Voice of Authority. This is their album. I shouldn't say there. This is the album under that name. Very big in America right now. So Voice of Authority was basically Adrian Sherwood's girlfriend, Kishi Yamamoto at the time, his girlfriend who played keyboards, along with another keyboard player, Nick Pleitis, and then Adrian Sherwood programming the rhythms. So it's a pretty good example of kind of how far out his music was starting to get about that time. And I see I'm running along on time, so I'm going to kind of wrap it up here for this part. And basically by 1983, the first few years of the label had been real heavy into the reggae sound, the roots reggae or dub reggae, with a few different elements creeping in and out. But in '83, his friend Prince Farai was shot dead in Jamaica, and it was a real blow to Adrian Sherwood. And so at that point, he kind of slowed down on the reggae type productions, and things went in a little bit different direction, although he was still putting out dub Syndicate albums. And a big part of that was a guy named Mark Stewart, who was the singer of the pop group, kind of came into the OnU Sound fold, and along with him some different musicians. So that'll be what I'll start off with in part 2. Yeah, so thanks for watching. Hopefully this was slightly informative or interesting, and I'll see you in part 2. Thanks. Bye.